On the 22nd of December, 1849, Fyodor Dostoevsky was led out before a firing squad at Semyonov Place in St. Petersburg after being found guilty of involvement in a banned literary group. Before the sentence was carried out, it was commuted to exile in Siberia for several years. Later, Dostoevsky went on to write some of the most acclaimed books of the modern era, notably Crime and Punishment, a novel in which existential dread clung to his characters as they navigated a story of psychological torment, paranoia, and guilt. It raises the question whether he ever recovered fully from his treatment and near-death experience. This is the story of Fyodor Dostoevsky, Russia's great existential novelist. The man known to history as Fyodor Dostoevsky was born on the 11th of November, 1821, in Moscow, Russia's former and future capital. Though at the time, in the 19th century, the city of St. Petersburg served as the Russian capital. According to the old-style Julian calendar that was still in use in Russia in the 19th century, his date of birth was the 30th of October. His father was Mikhail Dostoevsky, a medical doctor and civil servant who was admitted to the ranks of the Russian hereditary nobility in 1828 in recognition of his extensive government service. The Dostoevsky family ultimately traced its ancestry to Danilo Irtish, a Lithuanian nobleman who all the way back in 1506 had been given the village of Dostoyevo in present-day Belarus. Surnames in late medieval times were often fashioned as indicators of where a family came from, and so the Dostoevsky family acquired this surname. Subsequent generations of Dostoevskys moved to Russia and Poland. Fyodor's branch of the family ended up in Ukraine, where his great-grandfather and grandfather served as priests in the Uniate Church, churches that formed part of the Greek Orthodox Church, but which had close ties to the Roman Catholic Church. These celebrated Orthodox rites while also acknowledging the supreme authority of the Pope in Rome. Mikhail studied at a seminary, but ran away to Moscow to pursue his medical studies at the age of 15. Then, in 1819, the 30-year-old Mikhail Dostoevsky married Maria Nicheva, the attractive 19-year-old daughter of a Moscow merchant. Maria's cheerful and sympathetic character contrasted with her husband's more serious demeanor, but the couple had a happy and loving marriage. Their first son, named Mikhail after his father, was born in November 1820. Fyodor followed almost exactly a year later. The couple would have 5 more surviving children, 3 daughters and 2 sons. Fyodor Dostoevsky was born just a few years after peace had finally been restored to Europe following more than 2 decades of warfare during the French Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars that began in April 1792 and continued with few interruptions until the summer of 1815. Tsar Alexander I of Russia had succeeded to the throne in 1801, seeking to implement constitutional reforms inspired by the ideas of his Swiss tutor Frédéric César de la Harpe. Progress in this regard was completely halted by the necessity of dealing with the Napoleonic Wars. Russian armies were defeated by Napoleon at Austerlitz in 1805 and Friedland in 1807, compelling Alexander to make peace with the Napoleonic Empire at Tilsit. This ushered in another attempt at political reform under Alexander's chief minister, Mikhail Speransky, but increasing tensions with the French from 1810 onwards led to Speransky's dismissal and the end of his reforms. Napoleon's invasion of Russia in 1812 was a traumatic experience for Tsar Alexander, even though the Russians would expel the invader and join with Prussia and Austria to defeat Napoleon in Germany and France in 1813 and 1814, forcing Napoleon's abdication. Russian armies were in France again in 1815, after Napoleon was restored to the throne. While Napoleon was defeated for the final time at the Battle of Waterloo, before the Russians had any fighting to do, a Russian contingent remained in France as part of the Allied Army of Occupation until 1818. There, they came into contact with new ideas about more open and democratic societies, and in particular, ones where a better socio-economic system prevailed. France and other Western European nations were already heading towards full capitalist systems by the early 19th century, whereas Russia remained a profoundly feudal and medieval society where serfdom was still even in place. The Russian officers and soldiers who had breathed the air of freedom in Paris returned to St. Petersburg and were disappointed in the years that followed when Tsar Alexander failed to live up to his earlier reforming tendencies. They anticipated some improvements in the conditions of the peasant class who served in the rank and file of the Russian army, but instead the government was dominated by the much disliked General Alexei Arakcheyev. Some of the more radical officers joined secret societies seeking to overthrow the Tsar, or at least force a constitution upon him, which would involve the regular holding of Dumas, the Russian name for a parliament. Their plans were interrupted by Alexander's unexpected death in December 1825. Grand Duke Constantine, next in line to the throne, had previously declined the succession and swore an oath to his younger brother, Grand Duke Nicholas, who, after some hesitation, became Tsar Nicholas I. The radical officers exploited the confusion to stage a demonstration at Senate Square in St. Petersburg with some 3,000 men. Amid calls of, quote, Constantine and Constitution, the forces loyal to Nicholas initially sought a peaceful solution, but when this failed, the uprising was brutally crushed by artillery and cavalry. The 5 ringleaders of the rebellion were executed, and more than 100 participants were exiled into Siberia, the vast, cold, and thinly inhabited region of Russia, east of the Ural Mountains. Although Tsar Nicholas I had asserted his authority, the ideas of the Decembrists continued to circulate among the intellectuals of St. Petersburg. All of this foreshadowed the political and social crises that would mark Russia's history, as well throughout Dostoevsky's life and beyond. The Decembrist uprising shaped the course of Russian politics and society over the following decades while young Fyodor was growing up. Debates about political reform, the condition of the peasantry, huge numbers of whom were still serfs tied to the land and their feudal overlords in a kind of medieval quasi-slavery, as well as the nature of the Tsarist government, the power and role of the Russian Orthodox Church, and what it meant to be a Russian, played a key role in Dostoevsky's work. Although he would spend much of his life in St. Petersburg and other places, he grew up in Moscow. His father worked at the hospital for the poor in the suburbs, and the young Fyodor and his siblings often played in the garden with the poor children. Although Dr. Dostoevsky had abandoned his priestly career, he remained a devout Orthodox Christian, and Fyodor was introduced to the Bible at around the age of 4, as soon as he began to learn to read and write. However, the elder Dostoevsky also placed a heavy emphasis on secular education, and the young Fyodor grew up listening to his father reading from works like Nikolai Karamzin's History of the Russian State, as well as works by Russian poets Gavrila Dreshvin, Vasily Zhukovsky, and above all, Alexander Pushkin, the greatest Russian poet of the age. Nor was Fyodor's introduction to literature and history exclusively Russian. He loved the ancient author of the Iliad and the Odyssey, Homer, as well as modern Spanish and British writers like Miguel de Cervantes and Sir Walter Scott, and was also familiar with the likes of William Shakespeare, Friedrich Schiller, and Johann Wolfgang von Goethe. Until the age of 10, Fyodor rarely ventured outside Moscow, except for pilgrimages to the Trinity St. Sergius Monastery, north of Moscow, and one of the most important sites in the Russian Orthodox Church. This changed in 1831. That year, Mikhail Dostoevsky bought the small estate of Darovoy in his wife's name. Although the doctor continued to work hard and struggled to find time to go to the country, Maria and the children would spend 4 months every year at the estate and much less time in Moscow. Maria was a capable administrator who managed the estate effectively and was sympathetic to the concerns and strife of the serfs on the land. Unlike on many other Russian aristocratic estates, the Dostoevsky children were not prevented from interacting with the serfs and sometimes offered to help out. Such experiences gave Dostoevsky first-hand insight into the condition of the Russian peasantry, which would inform his literary creations, particularly the brothers Karamazov, arguably his greatest work. Dostoevsky later recalled that the fondest moments of his childhood were spent at Darovoi, though his stays gradually became shorter after he and his brother Mikhail were sent to Chermak's boarding school in 1834. The Dostoevsky brothers continued to be exposed to the leading writers of the day. Russian journals carried translations of French writers like Honoré de Balzac, Victor Hugo, and Georges Sand, but the brothers were particularly influenced by Nikolai Gogol and Alexander Pushkin. Both brothers dreamed of literary careers. Fyodor yearned to write a novel about Venice, while Mikhail was constantly writing poetry. As they reached their mid-teens, the brothers' literary dreams would be shattered. By the middle of the 1830s, as Fyodor was entering his mid-teens, their mother's health was in steady decline, and their overworked father was also not in the best of health. In an effort to ensure that his sons could make do should both he and his wife die young, Dr. Dostoevsky signed them up to the School of Military Engineering in St. Petersburg. The boys were appalled by this decision, but their mother Maria's death in February 1837 removed the final impediment to their departure and convinced them of the wisdom of their father's actions. At around the same time, the brothers also heard the news that Pushkin had been killed in a duel with his brother-in-law. Dostoevsky later remarked that had he not already been in mourning for his mother, he would have been in mourning for Pushkin as one of his great literary heroes. The confluence of traumatic events may have caused a throat ailment that troubled Fyodor, postponing the journey for several weeks. In early May, Dr. Dostoevsky and his two eldest sons finally left for the capital. Although they were disappointed by the prospect of becoming military engineers, Fyodor and Mikhail nevertheless were enthusiastic about being in the cosmopolitan city of St. Petersburg. The brothers planned to make a pilgrimage to the location of Pushkin's fatal duel, and then to visit Pushkin's apartment on the banks of the river Moika, a small river where St. Petersburg stands, and where the great poet had died. With such romantic notions in their heads, on their way to the capital, the boys witnessed a government courier climbing onto a mail coach and beating the driver with his fists for no apparent reason. The episode stayed with Fyodor for the rest of his life as a manifestation of the brutality that accompanied the extreme social inequalities of Russia's society in the 19th century. By the time the Dostoevskys arrived in the capital, they received another nasty shock. Mikhail was excluded on the grounds of poor health and transferred to a less prestigious school in Reval, present-day Tallinn in Estonia, which at the time was part of the Russian Empire. Fyodor passed his entrance exams, though the admissions official demanded a large bribe, a common occurrence in a highly corrupt society. The 16-year-old Fyodor began his studies at the engineering school in January 1838. The institution was based in Mikhailovsky Castle, built at the confluence of the Moika and Fontanka rivers by Tsar Paul I. After Paul was assassinated by disgruntled officers in March 1801, shortly after moving into the castle, it remained empty until the 1820s, when Alexander gave it to the school. Life as an engineering cadet was everything the teenager had feared. He struggled to adapt to military discipline, and he spent most of his time privately reading works of fiction, taking a particular interest in the fantastical tales of E.T.A. Hoffmann. He had few friends at school, apart from Ivan Berezhetsky, with whom he had lively literary discussions, though the friendship later turned sour. Outside the school, he befriended a civil servant named Ivan Shidlovsky, a published poet, who supported Dostoevsky's literary aspirations. In spring 1838, Fyodor failed his exams in military drill and was denied progression into the next class. The news was a heavy blow to his father Mikhail, who had retired to Darovoi after his wife's death and had started to drink heavily. Fyodor regularly demanded money from his father, which was reluctantly granted. In June 1839, shortly after Fyodor received a letter from his father complaining of his struggles meeting the financial demands of his education, he learned of his death. While the official cause of death was a stroke, rumors abounded that the doctor had been murdered by his serfs. Fyodor strongly believed that his father had been murdered for the remainder of his life. Although Dr. Mikhail Dostoevsky's death was certainly a tragedy for Fyodor. It gave him the freedom to pursue his literary interests to a greater extent than before. He did continue to study at the engineering school, being promoted to second lieutenant in 1841, and being given the right to live outside the school. He used this opportunity to attend performances of plays and ballets at the Alexandrinsky Theatre, and in 1842 he attended concerts given by Franz Liszt, the virtuoso Hungarian pianist, who was one of the greatest composers in the decades after Beethoven and Mozart. Such entertainments did not come cheap, and while Dostoevsky's salary as an officer was supplemented by the regular flow of funds from Daravoy, now managed by a competent brother-in-law, he was still frequently in debt. After graduating in August 1843 with the rank of lieutenant, he was discharged from the army in October 1844, determined to achieve literary stardom. He initially sought to write for the stage, but soon abandoned his dramas Boris Godunov and Mary Stuart. He and Mikhail then attempted to make money by translating foreign literature into Russian, and in 1843 he managed to sell his translation of Balzac's Eugénie Grandet. Balzac's realistic portrayal of his characters inspired Dostoevsky's breakthrough novel Poor Folk, which was completed in May 1845. The novel is structured as a correspondence between the two protagonists, the minor bureaucrat Makar Devushkin and the young lady Varvara Dobroselova. Their emotional bond sustains both of them as they go through the grind of daily life, but it is abruptly cut off when Varvara agrees to marry the wealthy Bykov. Following the marriage, Varvara adopts the wealthy lifestyle which she previously criticized and loses interest in art and literature, and Devushkin is left alone once again. Even before its publication in January 1846, Poor Folk caused a sensation. The writer Nikolai Nekrasov and the critic Vissarion Belinsky praised its author greatly for the realistic portrayal of ordinary Russians. While the character of Devushkin is based on the lowly bureaucrats who frequently appear in Gogol's stories, Gogol's protagonists are the target of ridicule, while Dostoevsky encourages sympathy for Devushkin. Dostoevsky became an honored member of Belinsky's literary circle thereafter. Despite his initial social anxiety, the praise heaped upon him encouraged his vanity, and he soon faced ridicule from his fellow writers. The young writer Ivan Turgenev regularly mocked Dostoevsky, and following a particularly humiliating episode in November 1846, Dostoevsky stopped attending the gatherings. Dostoevsky also faced increasingly critical reviews from Belinsky, particularly after the publication of his second novel, The Double, in which, rather than retreating from Gogolian fantasy, he doubles down on it by highlighting the split personality of his protagonist, Golyadkin, through a doppelganger who is more socially successful but behaves in a manner that Golyadkin finds inappropriate. Belinsky also had cause to criticize Dostoevsky's complex narrative style and his tendency to repeat the same episode from different perspectives. Their final break in early 1847 was caused by ideological differences. While both men had been influenced by the Christian utopian socialism espoused by early 19th century French writers such as Charles Fourier, Belinsky shifted further and adopted atheistic views which Dostoevsky could not stomach. Even so, Dostoevsky was shocked to hear of Belinsky's death from what is believed to have been tuberculosis in 1848 at just 36 years of age. Dostoevsky's feud with Belinsky had coincided with developments in wider Russian literary journalism and writing. In 1846, Nikolai Nekrasov had bought the rights to the periodical The Contemporary, founded by Pushkin a decade earlier, and engaged Belinsky as chief critic. Dostoevsky still had obligations to Notes of the Fatherland, hitherto Russia's leading literary journal, and continued to contribute a number of short stories. Among these was White Nights, in which the nameless narrator identifies himself as a young, romantic dreamer. He encounters a young woman, Nastya, who embodies his romantic dreams and values his companionship at a time when she is awaiting the return of an absent fiancé. Although the narrator's dreams are crushed by the appearance of the other man, he refuses to be disheartened and is thankful for the brief moment of happiness he had experienced. Despite the sympathetic portrayal, White Nights was intended as a parody of the romantic novels of the day and enjoyed a broadly favorable critical reception. In the meantime, he began working on the novel Netochka Nezvanova and joined an alternative literary circle convened by his former classmate, Alexei Beketov. This group only lasted for a few months, but it was through the Beketovs that Dostoevsky became acquainted with Mikhail Butashevich Petrashevsky, a socialist aristocrat who hosted a small group of progressive intellectuals. During the revolutions of 1848 in Europe, the Petrashevsky circle attracted larger numbers of left-wing radicals. One of these men was Nikolai Spezhnev, described as Russia's first communist, who invited Dostoevsky into a small, secret political society. The members also belonged to the larger Palm Durov circle, which planned to spread revolutionary propaganda throughout the capital. Although Dostoevsky was anxious that the Petrashevsky circle had been infiltrated by Tsarist agents, in April 1849 he read from Belinsky's letter to Gogol from 1847, an eloquent attack on the injustice of Russian serfdom in response to Gogol's defense of the Tsarist autocracy and the Orthodox Church. Dostoevsky's concerns had not been misplaced, as an informer named Antonelli had infiltrated the circle in January 1849. During the early hours of the 23rd of April, 60 members of the group were arrested and taken to the notorious Peter and Paul fortress in St. Petersburg. During the interrogations, Dostoevsky admitted to harboring revolutionary ideas, but refused to implicate his fellow prisoners. While Tsarist authorities failed to uncover the Spezhnev circle, in September 1849, a military civil court sentenced 15 men to death, including Dostoevsky. After reviewing the case, Tsar Nicholas commuted the death sentences to hard labor in Siberia, but choreographed events to exhibit his full powers as arbiter of life and death. Thus, on the morning of the 22nd of December, Dostoevsky and his fellow prisoners were taken to Semenovsky Square. They had no idea what to expect, but feared the worst when they saw a scaffold and 3 stakes rising from the ground next to it. The prisoners were led to the scaffold as the sentences were read out by an officer. Every single person gathered heard that they were condemned to die by firing squad. Dostoevsky's heart sank in disbelief. When a priest mounted the scaffold holding a cross, even the most disbelieving atheists stepped forward to kiss it. Petrashevsky and 2 others were manhandled and tied to the 3 stakes in front of the scaffold. The firing squad aimed their rifles at the 3 condemned men. Dostoevsky had been in the second row and knew that he was next in line. Every second seemed like an eternity as he awaited the fatal volley of gunfire. The drums began to beat, but rather than the death knell, Dostoevsky saw the soldiers lower their rifles. The Tsar's aide galloped onto the scene with the pardon. Instead of death, Dostoevsky was given 4 years of hard labor in Siberia, after which he would be required to rejoin the army indefinitely, a process that would restore him his civil rights. Dostoevsky was obviously overjoyed by the reprieve, and despite 4 years in Siberia, he was still able to continue his writing there. At the same time, he wrote to Mikhail while he was in the cold East, expressing the fear that his fragile health might collapse because of the conditions. Dostoevsky began his journey to Siberia on the 24th of December and arrived in Omsk in late January 1850. The cramped living conditions in the barracks that Dostoevsky shared with his fellow inmates were both unbearable in the summer heat and yet also bitterly cold during the freezing winter months, when temperatures could induce frostbite indoors without heating. The appalling conditions and ill treatment from the sadistic Major Kritsov impacted on Fyodor's health and may have caused him to suffer his first epileptic fits, a condition that would plague him with growing frequency for the rest of his life.